Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Polgar for Citizen Speaks. I have a new recording on a topic that I've actually covered before, but it may have some relevance to our present situation and our present problems. Lessons of 19, oh, and I would appreciate it if you subscribed, obviously, of course, that's important, and if you click the like button, because that encourages me to keep on going and doing this. So, this topic is titled Lessons of 1956. As I write these words on November 4, Hungary, the country of my birth, celebrates a grim anniversary. The 1956 re-invasion of the Red Army, which had occupied the country since 1945. After deceptively negotiating a withdrawal of its troops from Budapest with Prime Minister Imre Nagy and his government, the Soviets had ordered their return to the capital. Only the military and some of the government leaders were aware of this new betrayal, but they knew that there was nothing they could do to prevent a reoccupation of the city and protect its citizenry. On the evening of the previous day, my parents, my 8-year-old sister, 2-year-old brother, and I turned in for the night, unsuspecting of what awaited us. Before dawn on the morning of the 4th of November, the sound of cannon fire awakened us along with the 2 million other residents of Budapest. The Soviet artillery had surrounded the city and was shelling its targets in a barrage that was familiar for my parents, who had lived through the Red Army siege of German-occupied Budapest in 1944. They gathered the most necessary items of clothing, blankets, and food, dressed us warmly, and we took the elevator from the 6th floor to the basement. Before we left the apartment, we could hear the following radio address to the nation. This is Nagy Imre speaking, the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the People's Republic of Hungary. Today at dawn, Soviet troops attacked our capital with the obvious goal of overthrowing the legal, democratic Hungarian government. Our troops are fighting. The government is in place. This is my message to the country's people and to world public opinion. It is hard to characterize the feelings of the 10-year-old boy who heard those words over the crackling of the radio. Imre Nagy was speaking from the Parliament building, where he and the government were now facing the awesome task of leading a country of 10 million people about to be reconquered by an overwhelming power. He understood that something terrible was happening and that they were in danger, but could not imagine or understand the implications of what he, his family, and his countrymen were facing. He went to the cellar with his family to spend an unknown number of days there. He could not have known that this was also the end of his childhood, that this turn of events would change his life and lead to his family's abandoning of their homeland. This was also the end of an incredible 13 days that had started on October the 23rd, when he was in the St. Stephen's Square Elementary School and with the other students and teachers heard the demands of demonstrators outside the open window of the classroom, shouting for freedom, work, and bread, the removal of Soviet troops, and the reestablishment of a freely elected representative government. For the 10-year-old boy, it had not only been the end of childhood, but the beginning of an effort to understand himself and the world in which he lived. Later that week, in a square near his home, he had seen the grave of a fallen young man who had fought Soviet soldiers, and on a nearby street, the lime-covered body of a dead Red Army soldier. He had witnessed a change in the people around him that he did not understand until many years later. The somber, self-centered people who had inhabited Budapest for the first decade of his life were transformed into friendly, unselfish citizens. They greeted and helped each other, contributed to help the victims of the fight by dropping bills into open boxes on street corners. The fear, the suspicion, and the mistrust which had characterized the previous decade had dissipated for the boy. It was to take many decades for him to understand how this happened and why. Since it is impossible to understand history and its transformations completely, we are forced to rely on our senses and the foundations of our memory that those senses provide. So after much reading and study of what came to be known as the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, here are some conclusions about what those events have meant to those who lived through them and what lessons they may hold for the many who have not. In the immediate aftermath of the brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising against the Soviet might, most of the world stood with Hungary. Some communist leaders in Western Europe even turned against the Soviets, and men like Albert Camus condemned the bloody suppression of the Hungarian youth and workers who took up guns against the tyranny and fought to regain their freedom. The story of David and Goliath was often mentioned as the archetype for Hungary's uprising against the Soviet Union. But at the time, no one knew how accurate this was. The small country fighting for freedom had to go through 35 years of the most brutal suppression, starting with the execution of leaders like Imre Nagy, Paul Molitor, the Minister of Defense of the Nagy government, sent to negotiate with the Russians for the withdrawal from Hungary, and Miklós Gyimás, Géza Losonczy, József Szilágyi, and more than 3,000 men and women who were accused of counter-revolutionary activities by the Kadar regime installed by Soviet arms. There were tens of thousands of others who suffered persecution after defeat of the last remnants of resistance in various parts of the country. These included striking workers who refused to work for the reimposed communist agents of the Soviet Empire. But after 35 years, the Soviet Empire collapsed. And after much hardship and suffering, David defeated Goliath. That fact is the most important lesson to us here in the US. No matter how long evil ideas propagated and supported by powerful interests are forced to prevail in a country and subvert its moral, cultural, and historically accepted values, if people are not cowed, if they resist using any means at their disposal, they will triumph in the end. The next lesson Hungary had to learn after 1956 was that overthrowing a dictatorship imposed by a foreign power is not enough. The people who served that dictatorship, who were its willing agents and who had thus gained access to much wealth and power, must be vetted. In Hungary, as in some of the other post-communist countries, the weeding out of the willing servants of the dictatorship did not happen clearly and unequivocally. Many in positions of authority at cultural, academic, and scholarly institutions retained their power without undergoing any kind of a test of their commitment to pluralistic democracy, and just as importantly, to professional ethics. As a result, some of the most powerful cultural centers, like the media, the Academy of Sciences, universities, elementary and secondary schools, remained under the leadership of people who had served the Kadar regime and its unequivocally socialist communist ideology. Not until 2010 did the citizenry rise up and vote out the leftist, progressive, post-communist political leadership and began returning the country to its European Judeo-Christian traditions, the bequest of more than 1,000-year history. It took up the awesome responsibility of clearing away the detritus of the 20th century, including the consequences of the Nazi and communist terror. It began a long process of clarifying who were responsible for the crimes and who were the victims. That accounting is still in progress, and few are misled into believing that it will be fair and unerringly successful. One thing is certain, that the few victims who stood up to Nazi and communist terror, who chose suffering over complicity, are now receiving recognition. For most of them it is too late, but not for the society whose children must learn anew what honesty, bravery, and honor mean. What it means to sacrifice your well-being and comfort, even to be subjected to torture for the sake of truth and justice, and to protect the weak and the persecuted, even at the greatest cost to yourself. I must mention three names: Tibor Bach, István Angyal, and Maria Wittner. These representatives of thousands are well known in Hungary. Those who want to know specifics about what the above words mean should study their lives. Bach was a unique fighter against communism who was imprisoned, locked in a mental asylum, and persecuted in ways which are hard to imagine for those lucky enough to have never lived under a totalitarian dictatorship. Angyal, who was a young Jew who survived the Nazi concentration camp, joined the street urchins of Pest, known as Pesti Srácok in Hungarian, from the onset of the 1956 revolution, for which the agents of the reconquering Soviets executed him. Wittner also joined the street fighters early, including at Radio Budapest, the first site of the conflict between the rebels and the agents of the state. She was one of the longest imprisoned victims of the retribution meted out to the opponents of the communists, eventually becoming a parliamentary representative after the fall of their regime. Her picture is one of the ones in the picture at the beginning of this podcast. These three represent the real victory of David over Goliath. Each one died before they could enjoy the benefits of the struggle, since it is still in progress. But there is no doubt today in Hungary that they will eventually achieve victory. The country will overcome the effects of the most vile political systems ever to have ruled in Europe, ones which rejected European civilization, and with that the cultural and moral values upon which that had been built. It is already leading the way in the struggle against these aberrant political religions which had claimed so many millions of lives. The lesson for us in the U.S. is that we must turn against those who reject the values of our founding fathers, the values enshrined in our Constitution. We must fight against nihilistic, self-serving ideas dressed up as beneficial to humanity and society, but denying the rights and responsibilities of the individual. At the time the communist regimes were removed from power in what used to be the Soviet Empire, those of us who had spent most of the 35 years after 1956 fighting against the communists and their pernicious ideology projected that it may take 40 years for the countries liberated to return to some semblance of social and political sanity. We turned out to be, unfortunately, right in our prognosis. What we did not consider was the effect of the cancer of the socialist communist ideas of the lucky countries who had not had to live under tyranny that these ideas had bred. It took nearly 2 generations for the germination of those terrible ideas to reach fruition in the Western world. The seeds had been sown far back at the end of the 18th century in the terrible events of the French Revolution. Some few smart men had seen the effects of these ideas on our civilization. They tried to warn us in novels like Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and in philosophical writings like Nietzsche's terrible prophecies of the consequences of nihilism, and later in the writings of Conrad, Camus, Hayek, Bulgakov, and many others. We did not heed them. We still do not pay attention to the cries of our brethren who suffered so much under the 20th century's tyrannies. Instead, we persist in clinging to materialistic, atheistic, reductionist ideas about man's role in the world and how it should be organized in societies. We deny the spiritual, the things which require exertions of our imagination, especially anything transcending our insignificant brief moments on this ball of mud and water. We persist in our greatest hubris, which Nietzsche formulated as the death of God. We should heed the warnings of the many victims of communism and Nazism from Hungary and the other countries of Europe who suffered the brutalities of those nihilistic ideas promising salvation and rectitude, but delivering only damnation and injustice. That's it. Thank you. I hope you liked it. And if you did, then please subscribe or click the like button. This is Citizen Speaks, and I will see you again, hopefully, sooner. Goodbye.